Before I get started, I want to talk a little about my schedule. I fell into releasing on Monday, Wednesday, and Friday purely by accident, and that's unfortunate. And I say unfortunate because my schedule for releasing things on my blog has been Sunday, Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, and my release schedule for the podcast is recording on Wednesday and releasing on Friday. So if anything goes wrong, as has happened recently, and it takes longer than normal to edit the podcast, all the time I have to produce a Friday video goes right out the window. Therefore, I thought that changing to a Tuesday-Thursday schedule would work better, so I'm going to try that for a while. By all means, let me know if this works for people, or if you care at all. But now that our technical discussion is out of the way, let's get on to the video. I've already done a video by Ravi Zacharias Ministries, and I've noticed that they have a whole series of short apologetics videos focused on various and sundry reasons why people believe, populated by some really gullible people who give what seems to be entirely emotional and uncritically evaluated reasons why they think God exists. So, here we go again, right down the religious rabbit hole as I examine the moral argument for God and why it's all really stupid.
The moral argument is one of the most fascinating argument, and for me, I think is the most compelling, because we exist in a universe that has do's and don'ts. It has rules of behavior. There are things we are supposed to do and things that we are not supposed to do.
Actually, we don't live in a universe where any of that is true. There are no universal do's and don'ts. In fact, outside of some very general ideas, you can't even find do's and don'ts that exist across all social, national, and political boundaries. If we, as humans, can't come up with a standard set of morals that all people can agree to, how are we supposed to think that there is a universal set of morals that might apply to other species we might find out in the cosmos? This idea is really, really absurd.
Being has this sense that we are truly and really, in reality, obligated to avoid evil and to do good. Everybody has that sense of conscience. There's this real sense within every human being that there is an ought, there is a moral imperative that comes from somewhere. And it is universal, and so if it's universal, it's not just culturally shaped, even though some morality, certainly we would acknowledge, has some cultural factors in it. But this universal ought, this universal imperative, has to point to something bigger than humanity.
But humans can't all agree on what constitutes good or evil. This is a totally nonsensical claim that all humans know in their heart of hearts, whatever that is, that we're supposed to do good and avoid evil. This is demonstrably false. There are no moral imperatives. If there were, we wouldn't have sociopaths. We wouldn't have had Hitler or Stalin or any of the other mass-murdering, genocide-committing monsters that we've seen through history. The religious want everyone to get their moral views from some imaginary friend in the sky, but clearly that isn't the case. But when these exceptions to their universal rule come along, they just wave their hands and pretend they don't exist, or they create some excuse for why things didn't work just as they want to think that it does. Even the Bible makes it clear that this isn't the case in Genesis, where Adam and Eve, not having eaten from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, have no clue that disobeying God is wrong to do, and thus we are all damned to an eternal sinful nature. If we all had this inborn moral nature, there would be no sin. Theists have no explanation for that.
Morality or moral properties have a very interesting feature, and this is they are normative. They tell us how we are supposed to behave, what we're supposed to do, and what we're not supposed to do. And if that is the case, if they are normative, if we have moral duties, not just moral values, things that we have to do, it really does cry out, in my view, for a moral lawgiver, if we do have moral duties.
They tell us nothing of the sort. There is nothing inborn that tells us that. We find these things come from the culture and society that we live in. The moral structures in one part of the world are quite different from the moral structures in another. We may find similarities. We only find them where humans have similar wants and desires everywhere. We don't want to die, so we prescribe prohibitions against killing. We don't want to be abused, so we often make laws declaring equal treatment and equal protection under the law. But this is far from universal. Please go to the Middle East and declare your equality to men if you're a woman. Declare your equality to Islam if you're a Christian, or even worse, if you're an atheist. Declare your value if you're an open homosexual. They might throw you off the top of a building. These ideas are hardly universal. They don't even translate well from individual to individual, much less culture to culture.
I can go back to my days before I was a Christian and I lived a fairly wild life. Now, the idea that I didn't want God to exist was a very key issue in my life because I didn't want something to impose upon me. But there was a sense at one level that laws as such were just the imposition of society. They were the imposition of parents or schools or authorities or the police. And only suckers believed that. And yet, when someone did something wrong to me, I was betrayed in a relationship very badly. And I was deeply angry. In fact, I wanted to go and beat the people up that were involved in this because I wanted justice for the wrong that was done to me. So even in my non-believing state, that there was no God, there was no morality, there was a moral conscience badly orientated that I was following in some sense.
Beating people up is not a moral conscience. If you had gone and beat the crap out of the person who hurt you, you would have been dragged away by the police, charged with assault and battery, and put in prison for your crime. In fact, you knew that this was the case. That's likely why you didn't do it. You didn't want to suffer the punishment that comes with getting your revenge. But this isn't the case everywhere. In other countries, in other cultures, the idea of honor killings and murdering people who have dishonored you and your families are not only common, they are morally accepted by the people who have significantly different moral views than you do. Their moral conscience is different than your moral conscience, and both of you, I'm sure, if we put you side by side, would argue vociferously that your view and only your view was actually correct. Universal moral code's my ass.
Another society may disagree with those very laws. What we say goes for our society might not go for other societies, and a much more recent contemporary example is, of course, what we saw in the Holocaust. We saw the most educated nation at its time come to a point where it was systematically exterminating those who they thought were weak. Now, why? We have to ask the question why. If we jump straight to the idea that they were depraved monsters, we're missing out on key information here. The conclusion here was that if we are just meant to survive, if that's our whole purpose, then we ought to make ourselves as strong as a society as possible. So we're going to weed out the weak. It's our moral imperative to weed out the weak. There is no way we can conclude the Holocaust was wrong if we are cultural relativists, if we believe morals come from our own culture or society. But we know, as we showed in the Nuremberg trials, we know what they did was wrong, and we're willing to say that.
And now we have someone arguing for the moral superiority of the Nazis. Well, not really, but it sure sounds that way at the beginning. But he seems to recognize that there are no universal moral codes, nothing that holds true across cultural, across social, and across temporal lines. There was a time in the United States, not that long ago in historical terms, where owning other people as property was viewed as not only morally acceptable, but as morally commanded by God and supported by the Bible. You had widespread religious support for the idea that people with dark skin were inferior to people with light skin, and on the other side of the aisle, you had widespread religious support for the idea that this was simply not true. How can you argue for a single universal moral compass given by a single universal moral lawgiver when you have two groups of people both reading the same book making such diametrically opposed moral claims on the exact same subject? Are you people out of your minds? Morals are clearly relative. That's how the Nazis came to the conclusion that they came to. A conclusion, I might point out, that Christian reformer Martin Luther also shared. He wanted to throw the Jews out of Germany, confiscate their property, and if they didn't like it, he argued that they were welcome to whine to their God. Actually, The Western world did nothing about the Holocaust while it was going on. We had very little interest in saving the lives of the Jews or the Gypsies or the homosexuals because in the West, these people were largely discounted as valued human beings. We simply took our revenge against the Germans in the aftermath when people realized what they had allowed to go on. Some people have just no sense of history. Now, this is a pretty short video, as all of these apologetic videos from Ravi Zacharias Ministries are, but I think they point out some of the utter absurdity of these positions, absurdity that these people are totally blinded to because of their unquestioned faith. All of the evidence we have in the real world shows that morality is not static. We saw it in America with the end of slavery, with women's suffrage, with the civil rights movement, with gay marriage. All of these things are a fundamental shift in the views of society on what is moral and what is not. And you know something? It's always the religious that are on the wrong side of history. Always. These are never the people leading the charge toward a more godly moral view. If they are correct and all of us have this moral code imprinted on our hearts, we should never see these kind of changes that we see, either within the same society or across political and social lines. Our moral view should be the same today as it was 50 years ago, or 500 years ago, or 5,000 years ago, but it isn't. That's not how it works. Once again, we see the religious believing something that just isn't evident in the real world, but clinging to it whether it makes any sense whatsoever, and that's why the religious are so laughable. They just ignore things that are right in front of their faces because their silly religious book tells them to think otherwise, and they wonder why we laugh. But that's it. What did you think? Should I continue on with these short apologetic videos? I'll put the playlist in the description below. Let me know which one I should take on first. I'm open to suggestions. And while you're at it, please go read my blog and listen to my podcast. I put a significant amount of content out there for people to absorb every single week, and I really want your feedback. Let me know wherever applicable. So until next time, step back from your beliefs and see if they actually work in the real world. If you do that, you'll be weaned off of religious stupidity in no time, and that's a good thing for everyone.